Welcome to my second video, and I don't know. I don't even know how I'm going to start this one off. All I'm going to say is that this video, as you can tell from the title, is going to be about historicizing hooliganism. Hooliganism is something that we almost like fully associate with sports fans, specifically British, English sports fans, whatever you want to say. And it's something that I didn't actually really think about until very, very recently. It really wasn't until, you know, the events of last week where England versus Italy, I believe in the European World Cup, and England lost. And there was a massive blowback, you know, almost instantaneously. We saw rioting and stuff that was going on. I'm not particularly sure about the scenes in London, but it wasn't that pretty. And then, of course, you had this very racist blowback against the 3 players who missed penalty kicks, who just all happened to be black. And so this video was initially sort of going to merge those two things. I was going to look at hooliganism and then sort of tie, you know, those sort of like racial elements that I think we see sometimes in patriotism and representation, both like in sports and the military. But I decided to just make this video about hooliganism because I sort of went down this rabbit hole about being a hooligan. And of course now I'm looking at my ring light, not even the camera itself. I went down this rabbit hole about hooliganism and just looking up hooliganism in sports. Like there's different histories behind it, like instances that it's happened dating back to the ancient world, and really I think the beginning of organized sports, or like sports like soccer that we see in Europe today. And it was definitely looking at this long and extensive history of British sports, you know, British sports history. And I thought, okay, that'll just be its own video because it's just incredibly interesting, and I just found it so fascinating. I'm still looking over these things, honestly. It's really that interesting to me. And I just thought that this would be a very, I think, it would be a sort of good place to start, just by historicizing hooliganism. When we really think about it, what is hooliganism? Why is it so closely associated with sports? Why does there seem to be this sort of, you know, I feel like maybe there's this, you know, bit of a association that people have with sports fans in violence, especially in, you know, British history, British sports history. And I just wanted to sort of look into that and overall just make sense of it in the grand scheme of history. So this video is going to be literally about that. So sit down because it's a pretty wild ride, and there's a lot of crazy stuff that I dug up. So it's gonna be pretty interesting to see. Yeah, I'm sorry, my ring light kind of fell. Anyway, okay, so the first thing to go into historicizing hooliganism is simply just looking into the definition of what a hooligan is. So when I looked into it, a hooligan actually refers to as a violent young troublemaker who is most closely associated with a gang. So it's some sort of like a gang affiliation, I think. So I was very interested in that, the fact that it didn't really mention anything with sports, but it's actually almost related to, like, I think mostly like petty small gangsters, I guess, like young troublemakers and stuff like that. But that is actually just the dictionary, I guess, definition of the word hooligan. So I actually looked into the origins of the word hooligan and how hooligan emerged in popular discourse, especially, you know, as far as British history is concerned, and why it came to be something that we closely associate, again, with sportsmen. And I see that the earliest definitions have actually very, very little to do with sports, sort of kind of like the dictionary definition. So there are 2 origins of the word hooligan that I was able to find. The very first one would be, and both of them actually came about in the late 19th century. So the first one actually of hooligan actually referred to this group of boys. It was a gang that was in the Lambeth area in the UK, in London, in the late 19th century, in the 1890s. And they were referred to in the media as hooligan boys. This gang of boys also committed murder. In August of 1898, they were responsible for the murder of Henry Maplin. And again, British media at that time, print media, this Victorian era England, were sort of able to, they referred to these boys as hooligan boys. So that is like one of the earliest, I guess, sort of like origin stories that we have for the word hooligan. But I was also able to find another incredibly interesting tie to the word hooligan, and it has like a lot of anti-Irish sentiment in it, which I thought was very interesting. So I'm not somebody who's like was super knowledgeable about like Irish-British relations and how they've been for centuries now, but I got to watch the show Dairy Girls earlier this year. I discovered it earlier this year. I'm pretty late, but for those of you who haven't watched it, please go watch it on Netflix. And Dairy Girls actually takes place in the 1990s in Ireland, And it's just this incredibly interesting story of these group of girls and a guy who are, I mean, the guy, he goes to like an all-girls school, and they mention a lot about like Catholic versus Protestants, but also like you have this sort of like anti-British like sentiment, especially because I believe the guy on the show is actually British. So I sort of kind of like looked into that, and I realized that hooligan actually has ties to anti-Irish sentiment that was popular in London in England during the Victorian era. So this is the same era as the hooligan boys, and it is believed, it was actually an article that I read, and it's titled "How Soccer Helped an Ethnic Slur Take Over Europe," and it's by a journalist named Nikhil Sanad. And he talks about how the term hooligan literally emerged as a sort of anti-Irish slur. So in the late 1890s, and this is still Victorian era England, you had this caricature named Mr. Patsy O'Hooligan. And Mr. Patsy O'Hooligan was, according to the English paper in 1894, was exceedingly comical and a very wild Irishman. So it was just sort of a stereotype of the Irish as like wild and, you know, pretty savage and crazy, or whatever you might want to say. And his surname was O'Hooligan, but we also know that O'Hooligan, I would say we also know, but O'Hooligan is also an Irish surname, as is another Irish surname, Hooligan. So I thought that was like really, really interesting to note that hooligan may have an origin in anti-Irish sentiment, especially because I know hooliganism is also often tied to Irish sports fans as well. And in the British media, a lot of the British media historically have actually tried to sort of brand, you know, these young Irish youth oftentimes as hooligans. So I just thought that was like a very, very interesting thing to share, the fact that, you know, those are the two origin stories that I have for the term hooligan in, I guess, modern popular discourse. If anybody knows anything else, please feel free to comment, or like, you know, send me a message in some way, because I just find it very, very interesting. I just sort of wanted to know exactly how hooligan came up, I guess, how, you know, what its origins were. So that's what I was able to find. My ring light is not secured at all. Anyway, okay, so before we even get to the term hooligan, I'm going to be looking at, well, I mean, it still has to do with hooligan, but before the term was coined, we have so many examples of sports hooligans regardless. So one of the most interesting examples I was able to find, it's actually from an article I read called Hooliganism in the Ancient World, and it is hooliganism as it took place in Constantinople in the 6th century CE. So this was during, again, the 6th century. It was actually January of 532 CE. And what you had at that particular time, it was, chariot racing was incredibly popular in the Roman Empire. So gladiator matches had sort of been abolished, thank goodness, I guess, and I guess they thought they were being a little more civil doing that. So chariot racing was incredibly popular, and during this time you had 4 factions. You had the whites, the reds, the greens, and the blues, and these were incredibly popular factions. Like, there are even reports of emperors who you know, openly support one faction over the other, including an emperor I'm going to get to a little later. Everything is going as wrong as it could. I don't know what the movie recording can be stopped. Anyway, yeah, I was gonna say there were 4 really important factions. You had the whites, the reds, the blues, and the greens, and emperors openly supported these factions. According to Pliny actually mentions this in his literature, that jerseys were incredibly popular. Like, jerseys were incredibly popular in the sense that whatever the teams wore, the supporters and their spectators and fans wore as well. And it wasn't even too much about like how fast the chariot ran or horses ran and that sort of thing. It was mostly just about supporting your team. So it's like this very ancient like sports culture that I think, you know, we're seeing today. I guess we have its descendant today that dates back, you know, over 1,000 years ago. But this particular time, what sort of led up to these Nika riots, that's the name of the riots, and Nika means when, is Emperor Justinian. And Emperor Justinian was a fairly unpopular person. I mean, at this time there was a war that was going on with Persia that wasn't exactly going well. Emperor Justinian is somebody who actually supported the blues, I believe, but in order to sort of fund this war with Persia, and he was increasing taxes on everybody from the wealthy to the poor, and he also sort of like really cracked down on rioting and troublemaking that was occurring at these chariot races. And when it came to it's like cracking down on it meant like people were put to death. Like, people could literally be put to death for causing trouble at a chariot race, which I find incredibly fascinating. So it was this particular time he had, you know, sort of gathered these troublemakers together, and he was going to put them to death. 2 of them actually ended up surviving, however. They were to be hung, and I guess the ropes had broken, and they took this as divine intervention because it was the 6th century. And what you see is that it sort of leads to this movement. So when you're looking at it, it was the particular day that these riots really broke out. It was the Greens versus the Blues, but it wasn't really like Green fans versus Blue fans. It was sort of everybody coming together to protest, which sort of led to this full-scale insurrection and counterinsurgency for the Justinian, empire, like his rule. And it was absolutely chaotic. A large amount of Constantinople was destroyed and burned, and up to 30,000 people actually lost their lives in these riots. It is not something I think could happen at all in the modern world, but you never know. And what we see, and you're going to see patterns about like rulers and the powers that be cracking down on sports over time, just because things get too wild. And after this particular instance in Constantinople, chariot racing is banned. Like it's literally banned. They never can hold it in Constantinople anymore. So I just thought that was like a very interesting thing to share. It's like this ancient hooliganism that I was able to find in ties to this very Greco-Roman past, and I just thought it was just something that I guess wanted you guys to know. All right. I just removed my ring light because I don't think she was doing anything. I don't think it was doing anything. Anyway, alright, so I guess to start this video, what I'm going to do is just look at... I'm just going to be analyzing organized sports in British history. So when I saw those videos of people literally rioting, some people going naked, I think somebody was thrown in a river, and like people being beaten outside of the stadium, I've seen images like that before, and I guess that was what kind of like piqued my curiosity for me to be like, okay, well, how can I historicize this in a way that sort of makes sense, just sort of looking at the British tradition of sports in general, or at least maybe some of the medieval origins of soccer. And I was able to make a lot of ties that definitely, I think, clicked, like they rang bells in my head, like, okay, well, this all sort of makes sense. One of those things is Royal Shrovetide football. So Royal Shrovetide football was played, and what we're going to see for a lot of these early sports is they all have a religious connection. So Royal Shrovetide football was played on Shrove Tuesday. Shrove Tuesday is before Ash Wednesday. It's also a religious holiday. And Royal Shrovetide football has many origins. It's something that, according to oral histories, this is what I read, or Royal Shrovetide football may have ties in the fact that the original ball of the game may have been the severed head of somebody who was recently executed. And I don't think that you can... I really don't think that you can like downplay how serious that is. The fact that this football game have emerged from a game that the ball was literally somebody's head, a head that was just on a living person. That right there it's already violence. But what I was also able to look at is that Royal Shrovetide football, at least when compared to some of its earlier Celtic origins, more than likely emerged from a game that was meant to show contempt towards one's enemy. So, I mean, again, that's not exactly something that's like nice and sweet. Contempt is something that I think we're all very well aware. To have contempt from somebody, we have to have contempt for somebody is not a good thing. You don't like them. And that was another sort of origin to this Royal Shrovetide football game, which I find incredibly interesting. You had other games at the time. You had Atherstone Ball, and Atherstone Ball had two rules. There were two rules to Atherstone Ball. One is that you had to play, the play was restricted to a long street. I'm not 100% sure what a long street is. If you do, please comment down. And secondly, the participants are not allowed to kill anyone. Okay. It's another one of those things like, alright, so Atherstone football, you can't kill another one. You kind of wonder what made that rule get there in the very first place. And I'm going to continue to go over these games, and I'm also going to be very honest about the fact that over time, like, the powers that be crack down on the way some of these games are played, simply because of the fact that there's so much rioting and violence that is associated with them. And I'm going to be reading excerpts and, certain, like, even an eyewitness testimony of one of these games. And one of those things that I did read was an eyewitness testimony from the 16th century at a Shrovetide football game, where the eyewitness says that evil disposed persons had unleashed themselves on the crowd, and you had broken legs, broken heads, bruised and battered bodies. Like, that was his description of this game. And I'm just sitting back here like, okay, well, back in those days, I don't know if they had referees or whatever, but it's just very interesting, I guess, to like make those ties for whatever reason. I also do want to mention that Royal Shropshire football was incredibly popular during the 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War were these series of conflicts between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. And it wasn't a great time in British history. I mean, the medieval, this is the Middle Ages that we're talking about. It wasn't a great time for the British Isles. And there were lots of losses that they sustained over the course of this war, which I believe was around 115 or 116 years. And when you are considering the fact that it was very, very popular during this not so glamorous time in British history, those may also actually sort of explain its ties to violence. This was during the reign of King Henry II. This was dating as far back as the 12th century. And it's something that I think definitely you want to keep in mind when you are discussing like sports and hooliganism and that association. And if the violence, again, I'm going to get into this a little later, but if the violence and the violence that's associated with the organized sports was always supposed to be there in the first place. What I was also able to look at was, what I was also able to look at, though, was sort of like the origins of soccer in itself. So soccer is something that apparently dates back to the 13th century in England. And it's sort of like, and I want to say football, obviously I live in the United States, so when I say soccer, I'm just talking about football for everybody else, literally. And it was something that was developed in the 13th century, and it was played between villages. So you had two villages that would come together. The original ball was actually a pig's bladder, believe it or not. And it was also played during Shrovetide, Shrove Tuesday. So again, it has that religious connection. And it was the objective for the teams to sort of kick the pig's bladder, the ball, into the other church, the other village's church. And I want to read a quote from a man named Charles Cotton, who's a poet from the 16th century. And this is what Charles Cotton had to say. He wrote a poem, and the poem's first two lines are, "Two towns that long that war had raged, being at football, now engaged." Now, I don't know if part of this is sort of him being like, they used to hate each other, but now they're in football together, and that's great. Again, based on eyewitness testimony, that's not the tea. But part of me is also kind of like, okay, I mean, two towns that have basically waged war on each other for a very, very long time are now engaged in football. May have emerged from games, the earlier Celtic games about showing contempt for one another, may have emerged from a game where the ball was the executed head of a victim. Okay. Alright, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. So, these two towns aren't exactly friends. There's clearly a competition here, and I think he's sort of kind of alluding to that, or just talking very blatantly about the fact that these people don't like each other. And when you consider everything, it's very, very clear to see why evil disposed persons may have completely unleashed themselves on a crowd. So much so that in 1349, King Edward III, actually, I believe it was King Edward II too, that dates back. I think it was King Henry, no. It was actually King Edward III who banned the playing of this medieval football, this medieval soccer. He banned people from playing it because it was just that bad. And in 1835, you had the Highway Act passed, which also prohibited the playing of the game on the streets. And obviously that's much later. That's, sort of like the early modern era, but it's the same thing that happened in Constantinople after the Nika riots. It's literally this history of people doing the most, I guess, off of sports, and the powers that be sort of having to crack down on that. And you see that happen with Royal Shropshire football. You see that happen with this early medieval soccer. And I want to read a quote from that I was able to take about I guess a sort of description of some of these early games. So here's the quote. It goes, but it was hard in those days to distinguish the hooligans from the players. The folk games that would eventually evolve into soccer and rugby, games like hurling, napan, which was played on horseback with 3-foot clubs, France's La Sole, and Italy's Giocco del Pungo, were as violent as battlefields. And I think maybe that's why King Edward had enough, because there was already war going on, literally, and they couldn't focus on these literal civil wars that are happening between villages, according to Charles Cotton. So, when you really, look at that, and, these games were as violent as battlefields, evil disposed persons, I just want to allude to the fact that, violence was always when I say like violence, like peace was never an option. Like violence was always the motive in many, many ways. Like again, emerging out of a game to show contempt for your enemy. Alright, two towns that have long since waged war on one another. Okay, I'm looking at the early like medieval origins of football, you know, soccer, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, I guess it sort of makes sense why things are going left even in our time, only because like when you look at the origins of these games, the violence and the organized in quotes, nature of these sports, I guess they were never really supposed to be there in the first place. Or maybe they were supposed to be there maybe to a very, very, like, little, you know, have very, very little impact on it. Maybe in our modern era, we're trying to build that up. And again, I'm going to get into this a little later, like, towards the conclusion of the video. But when you do look at some of these origins of these games in their medieval context, or even their Celtic or Greco-Roman context, you're seeing games where violence is very much a part of the game. That's a perfect way to make sense and, you know, historicize hooliganism, because you're like, okay, well, if we're doing it according to these ancestors, well, maybe they're kind of doing it right. I don't know. Think about it. Alright, so we're going to get now into the part of my notes that mention organized hooliganism. So I'm going to say organized hooliganism. I don't know if I should really be calling it organized hooliganism, but basically I'm just going to be, this part of the video is going to be hooliganism in the 20th century and sort of how it came to be associated specifically with sports. So one thing that I did want to mention is that all those examples that I've sort of given you about hooliganism in the ancient world or the medieval world, those all predated the term hooligan. So again, we mentioned earlier that in the first part of the video that hooligan is something that was coined in the late 19th century, like the 1890s. And even then it was completely, it was not associated with sports in any way. So what I'm going to be discussing now is sort of how that happened. So as far back as 1909 in Glasgow, there was a soccer game, a football game that occurred between a Glasgow team and another team named Celtic. And during this game, the officials who I guess oversaw the game refused to allow overtime to settle a draw between these teams. And all hell broke loose. I mean, things went left pretty quickly, and I don't know if I should maybe like associate that maybe, because I know like soccer in particular, I only really watch soccer during the World Cup or football, and I know that like penalty kicks are major. Like they don't really do draws in football and soccer. So part of me is like, what if like this is part of the reason? Because like they didn't allow, and I don't know the history of soccer, but pardon me, like they didn't allow these you know, this I guess draw to be settled, and 6,000 spectators start rioting. 6,000 spectators start rioting. A lot worse than anything we've seen recently, and over 50 policemen are actually injured. They're injured when you have this, I mean, this riot start. And as far back, that was in 1909, and that is when you see sort of like the hooligan term sort of begin in a way to be associated with sports fans after this incident in Glasgow in 1909. But we don't really see it really get a full association until the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s. And there's a reason behind that. There is a quote by Mark Steels, who I believe is a British, I don't know if he's a British historian, but he talks about hooliganism can be closely tied with when a country or the citizens of the country feel as if the ideals that have been populated and spread around by that country are sort of like decreasing and blowing back. And you know, you really think of British history, you think of the UK, like the biggest empire in the entire world of all time. You know, the sunset never set on the British Empire. And you think of like the 1960s, you're sort of getting into this era that's, you know, very post-colonial. Again, you have this post-war, it's a sort of post-war sentiment that you're having, post-war angst in many ways for British youth. So in the United States of America in the 1960s, you have Vietnam. In Britain, you don't really have that. After World War II, you know, you don't really have, like in the US where, you know, because in the United States there's nothing we love more than war, and in the UK you don't really have that. So a lot of that association with hooliganism starts being branded on British youth that are coming of age in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it is this post-war generation. I forgot the exact word that they used, but this is a generation where, economically speaking, in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a very, very great time in Britain. And on top of that, you have, you know, the punk movement, you know, which is a very, very major thing. Like you think of like, you know, Sid Vicious and that sort of, I guess, aesthetic, which is really, really major. There was another Netflix documentary that I like watched earlier, and it was about a serial killer. Somebody has to like put it in the comments. I know it's like escaping me. A serial killer in the UK in the 70s and 80s who targeted mostly like sex workers. And one thing that I was able to like really, you know, they really made clear in that is that during the 70s and the 80s, it was a very, very tough time for a lot of people in the UK. And this is where we see hooliganism really, really start to blow up. I call it organized hooliganism because in the 1960s and 70s, what makes it different is that now you have firms. So you have official firms that are these group of guys, mostly young men, young boys, who are following their teams around. They're for their teams. There's a Manchester United firm. There's a firm for all these teams that are around, and these firms are following their guys around. And they are also oftentimes very, very close. They're doing the most, and a lot of time that most includes violence. I'm going to read a quote from a man named Hotshot, I believe was his name, and he has this, he was part of the Manchester United firm, and this was his quote about the state of firms in the 1980s. He says, "The buzz about the kickoff, you were Man United. You weren't running anywhere, or you weren't getting into the Red Army." Again, this is post-war. "We wasn't boozing. We'd be out before, ambushing other firms before the match started." Okay, so like already out the gate, they're throwing hands. It's already crazy. I mean, what are they basically saying? That he's basically saying that they're going out and they're looking to fight. They're not like their fathers. He mentions that who are off to war in World War II. You know, they're not like that. It's just time where it's about being crazy, and a part of that craziness is attacking people. And there's a lot that really happens because of that. And I think we have some sort of more of these I don't want to say iconic, but very significant disasters. In 1985, you had it was an Italian team, ironically, versus a British team. It was an Italian team versus the Liverpool Football Club. And one thing that Hotshot actually mentioned in his interview is how it was very, very popular for the firms to try to push the opposing team's spectators and fans from their viewing area. Well, this is what happened in 1985. And the Liverpool fans literally charged their Italian counterparts and try to push them for the viewing area. A stadium wall collapsed and 39 people died because of that incident, which is incredibly tragic. I mean, it's just horrible to think about. And then, of course, everyone knows about the Hillsborough Disaster, which occurred in 1989, where 96 people were essentially crushed to death. It is one of the scariest things. I can barely look at images of the Hillsborough Disaster, only because of the fact that I know that as somebody who's fairly claustrophobic, I mean, I literally live by myself in my own apartment, but like, as somebody who's fairly claustrophobic, like, just seeing those images is like anxiety-inducing. And it's another really tragic event that a lot of people brand with hooliganism. And again, that's in 1989. By that time, hooliganism is almost fully associated with young male sports fans. There was this video I saw, I think it was from 1990 or 91, and it's like it's in Dublin, and it's these sort of Irish versus British soccer fans, and a lot of them are bruised, like there's black eyes, there's like cut like foreheads. It sounds like that description that we read from the 16th century about broken heads and legs, and yeah, it sounds like that, and it's 1990 or 1989, okay? And I was just like watching that video, and the way that they were, I mean, you could see how that association had fully blown by the time we got to the 1990s. So that is like I think really sort of like making sense. It was in many ways it was a sort of political agenda by the British media to like sort of crack down on, you know, the young people who were wild and were listening to, you know, punk music and doing all these crazy wild things and all this drugs. You know, it was this perfect opportunity for them to look at them and brand them that way. But it was also this thing where you had these youth who, you know, they're not going off to war, they're sort of at home and they're bored. The economy's not that great, they're not doing much anyway. So they have this full, you know, they associate themselves fully with their sports teams, and they want to go watch their favorite football teams win. And part of that involves, I guess, in their example, according to Hotspot, just fighting and you know, beating somebody up. And unfortunately that led to a lot of really tragic disasters. So by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, again, hooliganism is 100% fully associated with sports. Alright, I guess we sort of kind of come to the end of the video now, finally. It's getting a little dark. It's raining outside now. It's not sunny like the other days that I filmed. Anyway, I guess now we've kind of gotten to the end of the video. This part of the whole point of the video again was, again, historicizing hooliganism, sports violence. I was looking at a lot of tweets when like the rioting was occurring and, you know, things were being pretty violent over in the UK. I think I saw this one video of like Italian fans being beaten up and jumped and stuff. I was seeing a lot of comments where people were sort of like, oh my god, what's wrong, what's happened, like, they were sort of acting as if it's, again, this sort of new thing. In many ways, they were like looking at these hooligans, I guess, crazy people, and they looked crazy, okay? And sort of being like, I don't know what's become of England. I don't know why they think they can act like this, because we all know that this is all new in England, and you know, there's no history of these violent acts associated with sports. But I was just like sort of looking at that, and I thought to myself, how can I kind of prove them wrong in a way? Like, how can I look at this history and be like, it's not something new? You know, hooliganism, again, what I said in the end of the last part was like, in many ways, associating it with sports fans was political, and it was fairly social, and it was something that happened in this post-war it's sort of tough time that was occurring in the UK in the 70s and 80s. And I thought to myself, okay, well, when we historicize this, when we look back at the emergence of organized sports in English history, what we are literally looking at is something that puts into perspective almost perfectly why the organized sport is so closely associated with rioting and violence, because it's always been that way. In our modern era, everything is supposed to be very civil, as civil as it is. You know, we have stadiums where the fans sit to the sides, and, you know, arenas. We have referees. We have, you know, we have policemen outside, we have security guards, you know, it's like a concert. And then you have red cards and yellow cards. You have all these things that we do to make sure that things don't go left. Obviously, there's a history of that, because I've said, again, like from King Edward and Emperor Justinian and the Highway Act of 1835, like there's all these things that they've always cracked down on, like violence and rioting in sports. But at the same time, when you look at their medieval origins, or even some of those earlier Celtic origins, you're not exactly looking at a game where the violence was supposed to be separate from the organized sport. The violence literally came hand in hand with that sport. As we've read, the spectators and the hooligans, well, the spectators and the athletes, it was hard to tell who was the hooligan. You know, if the game may have emerged from the head of an executee, that's violence. If it was emerged as a way to show contempt towards another person, that's violence. It have emerged, you know, or if it emerged out of this sort of long history of two villages at war with one another, that's violence. You know, all these things. If it was popular in the 100 Years' War, that's violence. There's so many things to sort of make sense of the fact that, like, okay, well, in our modern era, we are doing all these things to make sure that this isn't the case. But when you look back at it, it's like, okay, to the medieval people, that was part of the fun. I really do think that was part of the fun. I think that was part of the excitement. Rioting and just being generally crazy. And I'm not condoning violence. I do know there's one particular case I did know of hooliganism. This is like a more isolated incident, but it was the murder of Andrus Escobar, who was a Colombian defender in 1994, July of 1994, actually, this month, about 27 years ago. And he was murdered for scoring an own goal on Colombia that eliminated them from the 1994 World Cup. And it's just this ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous story, something that should not have happened. He was probably, I think, maybe 26 or 27 himself. It's a crazy story. But, you know, when you look at, when you look at an incident like that, that's like its own thing. But as far as like the general rioting and violence that you do sometimes see associated with these games, and I couldn't find like specific examples of somebody being put to death or dying, but what we are very well aware of the fact is that violence and, again, the game, it was the same thing. It all went hand in hand. So, again, historicizing is simply just making sense of something, and I guess I was able to make sense of the rioting and how bad things were looked over in London from what I was seeing from my, you know, a little American bubble on Twitter. And really make sense of it, like, okay, well, that's always the way it is. That's the way I guess it was originally supposed to be. I'm not condoning it. I think we should definitely evolve past what medieval people were doing, because they were doing a lot of things we shouldn't be doing anymore. But I do want to sort of like make sense, and I guess, just sort of make sense of why we see that. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please remember to, I guess, leave a thumbs up, comments, do some sort of engagement and whatever. But if you really liked it, I guess just in some way let me know that. And again, I'll just try to keep uploading at least like weekly, hopefully, so that I can just, I don't know, yeah. So yeah, would love that. Anyway, I did want to remind you guys that next week I'm going to be going into more of the more racial aspects of what we saw. Patriotism, it relates to sports and the military histories, specifically with black men. So I'm going to get into that a little later next week. But for now, it's just about hooliganism and looking at the very, very long and crazy history of people being crazy because they don't know how to act at a sports game.